Brother Terry.
Jahan, how are we?
Good. How are you?
I'm fantastic.
So this is our inaugural episode, as it were.
Yes,
Um,
yep. Mission Methuselah,
Mission
the
Methuselah.
Jahan and Terry.
Very exciting stuff. A podcast all about the biology of aging, how it relates to us.
Definitely.
Cool.
Trying to give some insight into some of the latest research, trying to break that down and then deliver it to various audiences and populations. The more the merrier in that regard.
Totally. Perhaps we'll start, since this is our first time being here, maybe telling us a little bit about ourselves,
Sure.
sharing that with people. So maybe tell me a little bit about your story. What led you to be interested in this field?
So I went to med school in 2015, graduated 2018, Deakin University here in Geelong in Victoria, Australia. And throughout that process, I'm a very active, fit guy on the side of things, and just sort of reaching an age where most of what I've learnt about how the body reaches its sort of peak performance is in the age category that I'm sort of in now, and naturally sort of inclined to trying to keep myself in that state, and which has built this sort of side interest around the biology of aging and how to sort of optimize things. And then when I met you in 2019, when we were on a surgical rotation, found someone who shared my interests, and you and I sort of hit it off straight away. I think it's fair to say. And
totally.
Probably talked
some
more
good
about,
conversations on the board.
Yes, probably talked more about this than we did actual work.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then now we've both decided that this is probably a really good forum for not only us to stay on top of the latest research, but to deliver it out to people in an easy to understand fashion as well.
Totally.
So I've got an education and teaching background. I was a high school teacher before medicine. So always interested in learning myself, but also trying to convey that information to others.
Yeah. And I think people might have gleaned from that we met on the wards, I myself being a junior doctor as well. But I think what's interesting, just to touch on our medical education, is how little you really learn about the biology of aging.
Definitely.
It's just, you learn a lot about critical illness and how to deal with illness when it occurs. But this idea of, the root of a lot of these illnesses being aging, and what causes that aging process in the beginning, is something that's not really covered. And it's a new field, and it's really fascinating.
Definitely. And in defense of med schools, like, you can understand why. I mean, the breadth of things that a junior doctor has to know is every day it's bigger than yesterday. In that regard, there's always something new for people to be learning. And this is a very nascent field, a very new field. So I can understand why the focus hasn't really been there. But
absolutely.
That won't stop us.
And I'd almost argue it shouldn't. To further that defense, to go even further.
Yes.
Because when you're working in a hospital, really, why someone's got old is like the last question you really care about.
Yeah, that's very true. That's
getting them better and out the door, and tweaking those dials of aging really has very little to do with it.
Yeah, I agree. Tell us about yourself, Jahan. Give us a bit.
Interesting. I think a fear of mortality is a great motivator in this field in particular. And so for me, I'm also of a similar age demographic. But I remember when I was in high school, I was obsessed with aging and wanted to crack aging. I don't know why. It was something that I just really was interested in high school. But I thought it was going to be like nanotechnology. And I was a physics sort of chemistry guy. And the reason why I did biology at university was to try and learn about aging and how we can, like, what causes aging. I learned almost nothing about it in my undergraduate studies, and got lost along the way. But found myself in medicine a few years later, and then found myself rekindling that passion. So that's how we get to where we are today, I suppose.
So you've had this interest quite a bit longer than me, I think, which is probably reflective in our relative knowledge. I think you're much more across the current literature, but it's fair to say that we're both. we're both trained in how to read through papers, identify their strengths and weaknesses, and then try to act on that. Any good doctor is able to do that. I think you've got a really good breadth of what's out there, and you and I discussing it, I think is going to be valuable to people. That's why
I think our powers combined will
yeah,
definitely be synergistic. It'll be good.
that's right.
It'll be good.
That's right. So I've decided to call the podcast Mission Methuselah.
Oof.
Jahan and Terry.
It's a great name, powerful name.
Yes.
And I think it speaks to what we're trying to achieve.
Definitely. So for anyone who isn't aware, Methuselah is a biblical character who, of all the people mentioned in the Bible, he is said to have lived the longest, approximately 969 years, I think. And obviously there's wide debate amongst varying religious demographics as to the validity. There are a lot of people say that this is just a metaphor age. A lot of people will take it as literal. A lot of people will say there are errors with counting it as lunar months and not solar months or solar years, giving him an age of 95 years or 96 years versus 969. But here at Mission Methuselah, we like to think he lived to 969, and we want to figure out why.
And I'd like to even posit that he was a crisp 900.
Easily.
Famously played by, I think, Sir Anthony Hopkins in
yes. Noah movie. Yes, it's Noah's grandfather, son of Enoch. Enoch went to heaven without experiencing death, which is a nice trick. And has a very important part to play in the Bible in that regard, and piqued our interest as well. Definitely.
Very cool. And of course, the word mission being not only a nice alliteration, but but implying a very specific goal. So yeah, very good. We got a podcast name. We got some players in the podcast realm. Us. What are we going to talk about today, Terry?
I think fasting was probably our first common ground that we found, intermittent fasting. And that's probably got a very large body of a literature backing behind it as well. Without getting caught too down in the weeds, so to speak, I think it's a really good place for us to start. For relatability's sake, let's talk about when we first met. You were using the Zero app, a bit of a plug to Zero.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, you go.
Oh no, I was using the Zero app and finding it very, very useful. It's always just fun to collect metrics about what you're doing. Hard data is incredibly important, I believe, because it's the only way to really know where you've come from and where you're going and where you are.
Definitely.
Otherwise, you're kind of just guessing.
Yeah, that opened my eyes immediately, because when we first met, I said, "Oh yeah, I'm fasting as well." I was fasting since around mid 2016, I think it was, or maybe even earlier. And said, "Oh, I do sort of 14 to 16 hours a day, no problem." And you said, "Oh, that's interesting. You should track it on the app. There's a free sort of download available." And immediately found out that I was only really fasting about 13 hours consistently every day.
Totally.
There was a way, like a very significant reporting bias saying, "Oh yeah, I think it was 9 p.m. was my last meal and I can do this." But when you get into the habit of clicking through and actually logging it, and I was like, "Oh, I'm not fasting nearly as much." And that was a very useful thing for me to learn early on, I think.
Yeah. So I think that's like perhaps the first tip for anybody wanting to embark on this journey of fasting is record them. And this app makes it very easy. And so just do it.
Yeah. Very, very easy to use, and gives you, there's a little motivating sort of factor there. There's a little knowledge section that you can work through. I recently just completed a full year of logging my fast.
What's the
marked as a year since we've met, I guess, and some interesting data that came out of that.
Yeah. What's the longest fast you've ever done?
I think it was a 22.1 hour fast that the app has told me. Which again, see, if I were to self-report, I would have said, "Oh, I've probably done longer than a day," but the app tells me otherwise. It's only 22.1 hours.
So, I think broadly, fasting can be classified in a few different ways. People use the term intermittent fasting, but that's a bit of a catch-all term, and perhaps it's a little vague. So maybe we should get the nomenclature down pat when it comes to fasting.
Yes.
I guess you could say fasting falls into a broad category of all sorts of dietary restriction, and fasting itself can take many forms. We practice regularly a 24-hour cycle of fasting where we break each day into a 24-hour period, and we say we're going to fast for this amount of time, and we'll have a feeding window. So that feeding window you could sort of think of as a time-restricted eating pattern. And so I think a lot of people in this space call it time-restricted eating. And then you can broadly speak about intermittent fasting as perhaps fasting for 24 hours to 48 hours in a go. So if, there's the classic 5-2 pattern. So you do whatever you want for 5 days and then you fast for 2 days. That could be considered an intermittent fast. And then you have prolonged fasting, where you do throughout sporadically, maybe, once a month, a few times a year, prolonged fasts of, many days sometimes.
Yeah.
So that's perhaps a way of classifying these things.
Definitely. Each with a varying degree of difficulty and compliance rate as well.
So I spoke to you on Sunday, and I said I'd clocked 20 something hours at that stage. I kept going. So I went for 70 hours.
Whoa. Wow.
Yeah. I couldn't be bothered going the last 2 to make it the full 3 days. My girlfriend, she came home with some treats and was just like, well, I'm just going to eat them. So
talk us through how that 70 hours felt. They're ups and downs, I imagine.
So I've previously done like a 5-day fast. I've done 2 previous 5-day fasts over the last couple of years. And this one was, for some reason, a lot harder. And I can't quite figure out why that is. I'm still sort of parsing the reasons and thinking about it. But it was a difficult time. Not like that difficult. It wasn't difficult from a hungry perspective. It was more just difficult from like a lightheadedness and concentration. I really had no concentration. Very difficult to focus on any of the tasks I'd set myself to do on the day. I'm doing sort of a data science micromasters, so I have a lot of maths that I need to do and watch some lectures, and it was difficult.
I can see.
Not impossible, I still did it, but it was harder than it should have been.
And I think that's an important point, because when it comes to trying to enact any sort of behavioral change, you and I have both experienced this when counseling patients. The main thing when it comes to compliance is how much of a disruption is this going to be to your everyday life. So whilst a 70-hour fast is phenomenal and obviously quite good for you, and we'll get into that in a little bit, it's like anything else. You're not necessarily going to be able to do that, next week if you've never fasted before. And it's going to be quite difficult and possibly even dangerous, depending on what your underlying medical conditions could possibly be. And what your
good point, doctor.
Yeah, we always recommend seeing your local doctor. But if you take going to the gym, for example, if you go to the gym and you work out with every single machine, over a 10-hour period, and that's your first day in the gym, that's not going to be something that you'll keep up. And I think I've found in my adult life that anytime I need to change my life in a significant way, I've paid a lot of attention to how can I do this consistently and regularly. As I said, my longest fast is only 22 hours, but I've fasted every single day for 3 years. I haven't missed one. And I think that's a useful thing to keep in mind. You're always going to get stronger and fitter when you do exercise on a regular basis. And sure, you're going to have your peaks where someday you feel amazing and you smash the gym for 4 or 5 hours in a single go, or you reach your maximum bench press or maximum squat, something like that. And I think that's probably a good way to class your recent 70-hour fast. It's just like you've hit a personal best and you were feeling good, so you went for it.
Totally.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Yeah, it was a bit of fun just to do. But yeah, I think what you're saying is a really good point. If you've never fasted before, Definitely don't bite off more than you can chew. Just start off with something simple, and do a time restricted eating window instead.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep.
Agreed.
Definitely. Fasting's interesting. There's a lot of hubbub, a lot of noise about fasting, but it's probably one of the oldest things that humans have been doing for a long, long, long time.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Most religious traditions have some form of fasting as part of their practice, whether it be Lent, whether it be Ramadan, whether it be ascetic practices that do really long-term fasts. Hippocrates is noted to have prescribed fasting in ancient Greece for a number of ailments. What did he say? Let food be thy medicine. Very useful. So we're really just rediscovering something that humans have been using for a very, very long time.
Yeah, yeah. Which follows the natural trend of a lot of sort of medical fads, I guess, is there seems to be, and not to speak against what you've just said, because I completely agree, but I sometimes get a little frustrated with the general population when they say, oh, this is, from ancient times, it's going to be really good for you. And I sort of think, I like to think that we're doing a little bit better than ancient populations.
Totally.
I think that modernity has something to offer in this regard, especially if you're talking about scientific backing. But I'm happy to eat my words on the subject of fasting. I completely agree. It's been a long-held tradition from ancient times that was very beneficial, and we can speak about why that is with some of the current literature.
Totally.
I think a good place to start would be the caloric restriction in rhesus monkeys, that study that both you and I have looked at.
Yeah, so it's interesting you bring that up. So caloric restriction was probably one of the first, dietary restriction investigations into dietary restrictions that were done. And I think, we've known since the early 1900s that if you starve mice, they live longer. If you starve various animal models, they'll live longer. And so leading to the 1980s, there was a whole bunch of literature that was done on this showing that, we feed these animals 70% of their required caloric intake and they live longer. And so that was a really interesting finding. And so that led to two really big studies conducted in the US on rhesus monkeys to look and see if we did the same thing there, would they live longer? There was one done at the University of Wisconsin and one done at the National Institute of Aging. And interestingly, I think what these studies really show is the complexity of the field.
Yes.
Because these two studies showed sort of conflicting results. So the University of Wisconsin study showed significant differences between the caloric restriction group and the non-caloric restriction group, whereas the NIA study really showed much smaller differences if they were there. And it really comes down to some key subtle differences between these studies. One of the biggest ones that I think people point out is that the NIA study, the monkeys were fed essentially almost their normal diet, whereas in the University of Wisconsin study, they were fed a sort of pureed diet that had a much higher sugar content. So in a sense, you weren't comparing apples and apples there. You were comparing a better diet versus a crap diet and then adding in some calorie restrictions. So even though one group was getting 70% calories, the calories they were getting were, worse calories. And so the people who were getting the full calories were also getting worse calories, but even more of it. And so there was a much bigger difference with caloric restriction. It's just, and what I think this speaks to is just a really how hard it is to, even in the most controlled environment, test these theories. I have an analogy that I like to use when thinking about this, if you'd permit me to just muse on this for a moment.
Please.
Yes. So I like to think of the science we do in this field as kind of like you're sitting in an airplane cockpit, right? And the pilot next to you has just died. And you need to land the plane. And landing the plane in this situation is kind of like finding, is living longer, is longevity. you have a whole bunch of dials that you can tweak, but you don't really know what the dials do. And not only that, you don't even know what's under the hood of the plane. How does the plane work? And so in this situation, one of the dials here is the number of calories you can give an animal model or a human being. Now, in this situation, we are the aeroplane. And we're trying to tweak with these dials to land it in a successful way. Fortunately, we have Microsoft Flight Simulator on a laptop right next to us. And these are kind of like our animal models where we can have a go and play with some of the dials and see if it works. But now we're trying to, with the animal models, take what we've learned from Microsoft Flight Simulator and apply it in a real setting, the human being. And sometimes that's not completely translatable.
That's a good analogy. Yeah, you can draw a lot of parallels from that. There's not only that particular aircraft that you're talking about and the engine capacity in that aircraft and the current weight of that aircraft, but also the environmental conditions that surround. And then you'd be comparing a different aircraft with a different human each time. And
it's so hard.
Yes, yeah. I think to speak more generally, before we get too much further into the research, you mentioned there a statistical significance. Now, most scientists and definitely most doctors, I would say, have a good grasp of what that actually means. But it's very easy to find differences when you compare two different populations or two different control arms of experiments, which a lot of the general population can sometimes be sort of clickbaited into, where this group showed a reduction in weight or this group lived longer. But the point of statistical significance is one that's not often appreciated, I think, because that's where you can say with confidence that there is a difference between these two groups, and you're trying to normalize for a lot of the variables that are involved. And to say significant is greater than 95% chance that we're sure this is something that's different, or a p-value. If anyone's going through these studies, it's obviously filled with a lot of technical language and technical numbers being thrown around, but that p-value is always something that you should look for. And the 0.05 is the number to keep your eye out for when it comes to
that. Is true. I will also say there's a meta layer on top of that, which where the hypothesis tests you're using to generate those p-values can sometimes be the wrong hypothesis tests. And of course, we know that science itself can often be plagued with so-called p-hacking. And look, I've done a lot of research. I've published a few papers myself, and I've gleaned and learnt a lot about this field of p-hacking and really trying to get the best statistics you can. And that's what everyone's doing. And the statistical methods, it's a whole interesting field in and of itself. And I will say, yes, look at the p-values, but then the more important thing is how you got those p-values.
That's true.
And so in biological fields, what variables you've controlled for is more important than whether you've controlled for variables or not. And so you can get a significant p-value, but if the variables you've controlled for are garbage variables that shouldn't have been controlled for, then it might be meaningless.
Yes, yeah, very much so. And that speaks to a normal human characteristic trait, right? Like if you're incentivized to try and publish a paper, then you want to have the most impressive values that you can put forward. And there's a lot of trickery when it comes to that. And unless you're an expert in the field, a lot of people aren't spending a lot of time reading through the detail of those studies. It tends to be read the abstracts, jump to the conclusion, and then sort of pick at piecemeal the areas that interest you. And I think that's still good advice for how you should work through a paper. But before you go giving lifestyle advice or major life changes based on this evidence, you need to make sure you're crossing all your T's and dotting all your I's.
In a sense, heuristics are still quite powerful. If a statistic doesn't match your heuristic, then you have to question the statistic. And after you've really rigorously examined the statistic, then and it's still true, then good, it's a good statistic. But yeah, there is a certain level of reasonableness that things need to satisfy.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So after that little diatribe on stats, we can jump back to the field of dietary restriction research. And there are two labs that I think have carried forward looking at dietary restriction modalities. One is Walter Longo's lab at University of Southern California. So he does a lot of really interesting work on intermittent fasting, so-called intermittent fasting. And then there's the Salk Institute. There's a bloke there called Sachin Panda, and he does a lot of interesting work in circadian rhythms. And especially, he does a lot of the time-restricted feeding window research. So he had a paper, landmark paper in a mouse model that really examined time-restricted feeding windows and a whole variety of time-restricted feeding windows. And he's the one that really established it as a valid strategy, at least in a mouse model, and that led on to further work in human settings that validated this as a potential tool.
Yeah.
And I think the linking of eating to this circadian clock is such an interesting one.
Yeah, very much so. So if we agree that we've established that caloric restriction or limiting how much you eat and when you eat is a positive thing, which the literature has, albeit sometimes in a sketchy manner and other times in a quite a clear manner. But I think it's generally accepted that it will not only make you live longer, but also make you live healthier. So now we get into some of the interesting fields that you've just mentioned about. Okay, so when is the right time to go into a starvation mode or a fasting mode, and when is the right time to go into a eating or feasting mode? And you brought up the circadian rhythm there, which is a very interesting area. I think my natural inclination was that I didn't think it would really matter all that much, but I think quite a few papers now are starting to show that I'm wrong, and it does look like there are better times to fast and better times to eat as well.
I want to share with you a study that was done in France, and this is not a longevity paper at all. But it really, the finding in this paper was so interesting in terms of this circadian rhythm on a cellular level. So this was a paper in the field of cardiac surgery, something that I've done a bit of research in the past and I have an interest in. But this paper looked at the time of day that the cardiac surgery was done. And it found that in the afternoon, there was a protective effect of a PM surgery as compared to an AM surgery on this particular cohort. And it was such a good paper. It was in the Lancet. And they did three things. They did a propensity matched cohort study. They then did during the operation, they took atrial biopsies. So they took a little biopsy of the heart tissue itself to look and see what the heart tissue looked like. And they did a third component, which I can't remember from memory what it was, but it doesn't really matter. The point is they had essentially three experiments in one to try and investigate this hypothesis. So it was a very rigorously conducted study. And what they found was that the PM group had less heart failure after the operation. They had less. So one thing you can measure is the troponin, and troponin is an enzyme released from the heart when it's stressed. The PM group had a less release of troponin after the operation. So the idea there being that the heart muscle was less stressed during a PM group. They also found that the PM group in the atrial biopsies had a whole bunch of circadian controlled genes that were switched on at the time in compared to the AM group. And so there was these fundamental cellular differences in the heart tissue based on the time of day. And that this was actually protecting the heart against ischemia, so lack of blood supply, and reperfusion injury due to heart surgery. And it was such an interesting finding when I read this paper. I was like, wow, what the hell? Like, should we be doing now, surgeons will, there are a lot of reasons to critique the study. It was fairly select type of operation. It was only aortic valves, and there's a whole host of other things. So you can't take that and say we should only be doing heart operations in the afternoon.
Exactly.
But to me, it speaks to this fundamental circadian clock in human beings, and the interplay it has with our health. And then this links back in with this work from Sachin Panda, who's looking at this time-restricted feeding window and when should we be eating during the day, and for how long should we be eating, and how does this fit in with this day-night cycle that we all live.
Yeah, definitely. And it's such a huge, powerful hormonal effect on our body. I mean, this is something that you put someone in a pitch black, dark cave, and that this rhythm will still keep quite consistent timekeeping, so to speak, about what's going on. So it's definitely something that seems to marry up with what we're talking about quite well and should be investigated further. And it's a good point we'll get to at some stage, talking about the compliance issue as well. Because sometimes it's quite easy to skip breakfast and have your fasting period from late the night before and push it out and have your first meal sort of early in the afternoon, which is probably what I've prescribed to the most. Not only does it match well with a busy lifestyle of having to get up early to go to work at the hospital, but also seem to fit with that late night snacking. And a lot of my karate training is more commonly in the evening, and after you've had a big workout, you want to sort of refuel and crack on. But not only does it have implications for your sleep, as we're about to get into, that doesn't really match with the good time to fast, so to speak.
Yeah, potentially. It's such an interesting question. So from the literature, I think we can probably say, without a doubt, doing some sort of time-restricted feeding is better than doing no time-restricted feeding.
Agreed. Yes.
We can also then ask the question, but if we're going to do time-restricted feeding, when should we be doing it? And from my review of the literature, it's probably, unfortunately, the earlier is better. So there are a couple of studies that have looked at diabetic patients, or not diabetic patients, so patients who are pre-diabetic. So they haven't been diagnosed with diabetes, but certainly either at risk of diabetes or have maybe slightly higher fasting blood sugars.
And just to pause you there,
and these studies then looked at time-restricted.
So we can reach everyone. The diabetes is obviously a very common health condition, and a lot of people would have some general understanding. And to really simplify it here, I apologize to my medical scientific colleagues who you'll be able to critique what I'm about to say, but you could summarize diabetes as being some sort of impairment when it comes to secreting insulin. And insulin is a hormone that helps to do quite a range of things in the body. But when speaking of diabetes, as a first step, it's a good idea to think about it as pushing glucose or sugar into the cells, and the body can store it and hence utilize it. And insulin is produced in the pancreas, an organ situated sort of below the stomach in the abdomen area. And there are certain cells within that pancreas that are responsible for secreting that insulin, the beta cells within the pancreas. And so there's some issue with the insulin being secreted, and then even the insulin that's there not being able to exert its normal effect. Now that's a spectrum of an issue. Like everything in the body, before I went to med school, I thought everything was black and white when it came to medical conditions. And obviously I was naive, and nearly every condition has a spectrum. So you've got someone who is secreting the right amount of insulin and it's having the right effect, and we would call that person, not having diabetes. And then you've got someone who has a huge problem with either secreting that insulin or the insulin having its effect in the body. And then there's everywhere in between. So Jahan's just highlighted a population that's termed pre-diabetic. So we are noticing that your your glucose levels are trending up and your insulin levels are trending down. So you're not producing enough insulin, and the insulin that's there isn't having the right sort of effect on the body. And you can identify these patients as being at risk. And that's sort of probably where my interest lies the most in most areas of medicine. You want to catch things as we're slowly starting to go off the rails, and that's the biggest sort of jackpot when it comes to changing your lifestyle or introducing medications to get you back onto where you should be. So this study's highlighted the pre-diabetic people. So you've captured the right sort of population where you want to intervene and try to get them back on course. Sorry, go ahead.
Reverse that trend. I would just make one small correction there in saying that in these pre-diabetic patients, not only are their blood sugars going up, but their insulin's going up as well. They can't make enough insulin. Well, they can't make enough insulin to do the job, and so the pancreas makes more and more insulin.
Yeah,
and they're hyperinsulinemic, so-called hyperinsulinemic.
True.
Exactly, because the problem's actually happening at the level of the cell in the body, absorbing the sugar rather than making the insulin itself. But so in this patient group, these guys had early time restricted feeding or late time restricted feeding, and the bigger effect in terms of normalizing their blood sugars and these markers was in the early group rather than the late group. Late group still had an effect, but
and that's important to know.
Had a bigger effect.
It's better to do some sort of time restricted feeding than not at all, and that was proven in this study as well. Very important take home factor. Yep,
definitely. Yeah. So it's a little bit disappointing because I tend to sit in that camp of wanting to eat later in the day, and it's just much easier to eat later in the day. So would that it were the case, and you never know. Maybe this is a pre-diabetic cohort, so it might be that in a normal, healthy human being, there's no difference, and then in fact, time-restricted feeding is the same, has the same positive effect regardless of when you're eating. But
which is something the authors were aware of.
One interesting term that comes. Sorry.
I think the authors were aware of that as well, and that they've picked a good population group to sort of garner interest of the scientific community. And they did think about that in terms of how they set up the study as well. I thought it was a very elegant sort of solution that's widely used in other areas of medical literature. But they had randomized their people into the two groups of late and early, and they went through that period for, I think it was 7 weeks. And then they crossed over after a washout period as well. So they were put into these groups of early or late, and then spent a period of time where they went back to their normal sort of lifestyle, and then swapped over into the other group, which is, again, this just gives some inclination to you're flying that plane and you're trying to control for as many variables as possible. That's one way, and quite an elegant way to try to control for the wind speed and the engine RPM and the cargo in the back. But again, there's a million different things to control for, and what we're looking for here is the general trend.
And so I guess what we're talking about here is really randomization. Randomization is a powerful tool for making or trying to ensure that both groups that you're testing on, whether it be the control group or the treatment group, have the same characteristics, and you're really comparing apples for apples, and there's no secret variable that is going to affect the outcome. And this is when sample size becomes a problem, because the smaller the sample size, the more likely you are that you accidentally randomize, that through randomization you accidentally, just through chance, have some variable that's different between groups.
Yes.
And of course, every study will measure in each group a certain set of characteristics and make sure they're the same and report it if they aren't. But you can't measure everything. And so it's these unknowns that randomization is really trying to control for. But with a small sample size, there's always a probability that there's something important that's different that you're not measuring. And a lot of these studies in humans, really, they'll have sample sizes like 15 or 20. people. And it's the best we can do, and it's not bad, but it's you can't take one study in isolation. You really need replication of those studies. And this speaks to a broader issue in science, which is that replication studies just aren't being done. Replication studies aren't sexy. They're not new, but they're important. And so, you have these findings in these cohorts that need to be replicated again and again, just to make sure that we aren't missing anything, or make sure that in a different cohort, in a different country, you find the same thing.
Definitely.
So it's a space to be watched.
It's not well appreciated, that aspect of science in general, especially medical literature as well. You've got to have the right people at the right time, motivated in the right way, and it's a market like anything else. Scientific research, you've got to be trying to produce as many papers as possible. The more sort of landmark and breakthrough they are, the better it is for your career. But I mean, what else do we have? This is a tried and true approach, the scientific approach, that I believe in wholeheartedly. If something's true, this is definitely the best way to try to figure that out. But I'm the first to acknowledge the limitations of it as well.
The scientific method is beautiful. It's just hard on these sort of questions.
Very hard, and time consuming. We're seeing that right now. For anyone looking back at this in the future, it's during the COVID-19 pandemic, and people want answers. People want solutions on how to best deal with this situation, and rightfully so. But we're so spoiled, I think, in that regard. Of we're the beneficiaries of hundreds of years worth of medical research and knowledge on most topics. And that's why we can do some of the phenomenal things that we can do with medicine right now. But something that's as novel as COVID-19 and new, we haven't got the time. The time effect hasn't happened yet for us to go through in a systematic way, identify some of the variables, and then repeat them, as you've said. It's
certainly
a difficult thing to deal with.
Yeah. Speaking of COVID-19, I know in Walter Longo's lab, I think they've done some work, or at least have published, making the claim that intermittent fasting might prime the immune system to help combat COVID. However, I would not recommend fasting necessarily if you have COVID.
Yes.
That space is untested, but if you want to try and prevent COVID, you can certainly improve the function of your immune system through fasting. So
definitely,
that's an interesting.
We know that being hungry activates the very special set of genes, the sirtuins, which is a podcast in and of itself that I'm sure we will explore. But to basically sum it up, and this is good advice that I'm happy to stand by, is that if you feel hungry, you're activating the sirtuin pathways, and that's doing a whole host of good things for you when it comes to longevity. So being hungry is a good thing.
So we've sort of covered the role of time-restricted feeding in this pre-diabetic group, but guys like you and me, we're resistance-trained males.
Yes.
And so I want to know, is there literature in resistance-trained males? What does that show?
Exactly.
And there is. There was a study done, cited some 200 times on a cohort, I think of around 30 resistance-trained males or so, looking at time-restricted feeding on a bunch of cardiovascular risk markers, as well as a whole bunch of other things. And it showed, broadly speaking, positive effects on HDL. I think the HDL went up, their triglycerides went down, so those cardiovascular risk factors improved, and these were healthy people, so that's a good thing.
HDL, for anyone listening, is a cholesterol marker that's found in the blood. A lot of the population is sort of aware of that if you're keeping up regular visits with your GP, as you should. And triglycerides being a measure of fatty acids in the body.
These guys did a fairly conventional lipid panel, so they looked at total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and I know for a lot of people who are very interested in this space, lipidology and lipid panels are a whole other kettle of fish. But for now, this is
a different aircraft involved in a different disaster heading to the ground.
And I would love to cover that at some stage, but
yes,
not right now. So that's what these guys measured, and certainly. Looking at HDL cholesterol, it's a useful metric, I think, still to some degree, and that improved. And triglycerides are definitely a useful metric, and those decreased. Interestingly, as well, in terms of that, this was, I think, an 8-week study in these resistance-trained males. The time-restricted feeding people consumed less calories, I believe, but they did not lose any weight. So which is very important for us resistance trained males. We don't want to lose weight.
Exactly. You don't want to compromise the gains, so to speak.
Exactly. And so the gains were not particularly compromised. There was another study that I read on this particular space, looking at untrained males who then conducted resistance training 3 times a week. And although there was no statistical significance in the gains, so to speak, there was a difference in an effect size measurement called Cohen's d. We won't need to go into that, but it not a statistically significant effect size difference, but there was nevertheless an effect size difference between the two groups, which stands to reason because you're usually consuming less calories, and you're not going to bulk up. You just won't. It's just the physics rather than the biology of it. But importantly, you don't lose your gains. One thing that people do obsess about is testosterone.
That's a very common complaint or concern that people express when they're in this space. I would agree. Yes.
But if I do this, is it going to affect my testosterone? And in the original study, the one that was cited some 200 times, I just want to correct myself as well. This cohort had time-restricted eating, but they were calorie matched. The time-restricted feeding group were calorie matched to the non time-restricted feeding one. This time-restricted feeding group was also eating between 1 p.m. and 9 p.m. and they had 3 meals in that window, that 8-hour window. So it was a 16-8 schedule. And what they found was that the testosterone was actually lower after the 8-week period, significantly so. I've been trying to grapple with this finding personally because I don't like it. And I think it's important to do some qualifications here, and recognize a few things. One is testosterone has its own circadian cycle.
Yes.
And testosterone also is known to dip after a meal. So there's a postprandial dip in testosterone.
Yes. So that stands to reason that when you're testing for these levels of testosterone is as important as testing itself in general. So
precisely.
Another confounding factor. This is the weeds that we're down in when we're talking about medical literature.
The weeds.
You find a finding, how do you get
there? It's a problem with a blood test endpoint as well, because a blood test really is a snapshot in time. Very frustrating. You don't get that rate of change. You simply get an absolute value.
Yes.
And oftentimes the derivative is more important than the actual value itself. So
how it's changing and when
exactly
is the thing that we want to know. And if you just measure it once, what can you do with that information?
So, but nevertheless, we have a testosterone pre time-restricted feeding, and we have testosterone 8 weeks after, and it's lower. So how do we rationalize this this result? Well, I passed the study pretty carefully, and I couldn't find any answer as to when they tested testosterone. And so it's sort of frustrating to try and make heads and tail of whether this is an accidental finding rather than a true finding. Linking back to this circadian idea, the Sachin Panda and his group talk about this idea of metabolic jet lag, where lots of people are eating at various times of the day, and this is always changing, and so we're always in this almost jet lagged state in a physiological sense because of our erratic eating habits. So it might be that this time-restricted feeding group, you're measuring their testosterone. Let's assume that these guys measure testosterone at the same time of day, at the beginning and at the end. You take a time-restricted feeding group, you sample their testosterone at the beginning, you shift their circadian rhythm using this time-restricted feeding, and then you take a sample of their testosterone in after the 8 weeks. And it's different, statistically different, it's statistically lower. But what does that mean? All it could be showing is that you've shifted their circadian rhythm slightly.
Exactly.
That's all it could be showing, potentially.
At a different point. Yes. Yep.
And so this is an example of why we need replication of that, because there will always be methodological differences in studies, and these might produce different results and might spur new questions. The rhesus monkey caloric restriction study, another example of why replication is so important. A study in isolation is a bit like a blood test in isolation, can often be meaningless.
Exactly.
But nevertheless, an interesting finding, but hard to say what it means. So it's not going to affect my my time-restricted feeding habit, and certainly I don't feel like I've got lower testosterone as a result, but who's to say? I can guarantee you after 70 hours I probably have lower testosterone.
Yeah.
That's almost guaranteed.
Yeah.
Prolonged fasting has some very profound physiological changes to the body. So, but time-restricted feeding, I'd be so surprised if it had that big of a difference. And it's important to note as well, it was only, maybe a 5-point difference. So it went from like 20 pre to 16 or 15 post time-restricted feeding after 8 weeks. So it's almost like a circadian level change. It's not like a dramatic drop in testosterone that you might see if, blocker or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the amount that it drops as well, although statistically significant, the absolute value is something to keep in your mind. Before I made it seem it's all about that p-value, but you've got to look at the absolute numbers as well. It's every bit complex. The Dunning-Kruger effect is so applicable in the sense that you think you know something, and then the more you know, you realize the less you actually can sure about. And I'm envious of people that sit in that high confidence part where if you keep researching, you'll realize how complicated things can become, and you might find yourself down in the trough where I tend to exist on most subjects.
Absolutely. If you're not constantly humbled, then you're not doing it right, I think.
Was that the same? The resistance trained males? Is that the same study that I'm remembering with the adiponectin levels were affected there? Is that the same study? Am I correct?
I think so. Yeah, the adiponectin. Yeah.
Tell people what adiponectin. I mean, again, we can go into a whole podcast on most of these subjects, but in a broad sense, how would you describe that to a patient if you're on the ward?
Me personally, look, I don't know too much about adiponectin, so maybe you should tell me more.
I think you can combine that. It's useful to talk about that in the same space as leptin and ghrelin as well. These are certain hormones that they've got an effect on how hungry you feel and how full you feel, and whether or not you should be eating. And basically, you can summarize all this as it was pushing things in the right direction, the direction where we want to see that you feel more full and you feel less hungry. So this speaks to a compliance issue as well, which is, I'm always bringing it back to that, because unless you can enact these new changes we're talking about in a consistent manner, it's not going to be something you do for 3 days and then you realize, I can't do this for the rest of my life, and move on. And then blame the changes that you that you have on your own lack of compliance. So if you're feeling less hungry and your body is reacting in a way where it doesn't actually feel like it needs to be consuming more calories, that's a huge positive thing. And this study was backing that up, which is important to realize. Which again speaks to if you go to the gym on a regular basis, you exercise on a regular basis, you feel you have more energy, you rest better, you improve your own immune system and functioning, and you can continue to do those things. It becomes easier and easier to keep going to the gym, not only from a psychological point of view, because you treat it just as brushing your teeth or having a shower. Your body is also primed to continue to do that thing, and fasting, unsurprisingly, seems to match through with that as well. The body can get used to this, and we're talking about the hormones that are in the background giving us that effect, that I feel like I can do this. After doing it for a few weeks, this is becoming easier and easier, and I'm getting better and better at it. So it's just important. I think it's fascinating to find that this is backed up by the study of hormones in the body, that in this particular study at least.
I think it's such an interesting thing when you look at these hormones like adiponectin, leptin, ghrelin. They're really complex systems.
Yes.
And what I mean by this is, yes, we think of ghrelin as the hunger hormone. It's released when you're hungry. It goes down when you're sated. But it has so many effects on the body. And it's not really just a hunger hormone. It's a lot more than that. And let me give you a surgical example. So
Please.
we know that in people with type 2 diabetes, if you do a gastric sleeve, so ghrelin is released by cells in the stomach, and a gastric sleeve operation is where you cut out a large portion of the stomach in order to help someone lose weight.
The
So people
Roux-en-Y
who've had a
procedure,
gastric
is that the most
sleeve,
common?
now a gastric sleeve is probably the most common.
Okay.
Roux-en-Y you can do, but it's not as popular anymore. Largely because you're connecting a part of bowel to the stomach in a way that can cause issues long term. But
Yeah.
gastric sleeves are good, and unless something goes horribly wrong, safe and well tolerated procedure. All surgeries have complications. Side note.
Yes. Yeah.
So we know that if you have a gastric sleeve, almost straight away you go to the recovery bay. If you're someone who has high blood sugars, terribly controlled diabetes, you can almost you normalize your blood sugars by the time you get to the recovery room.
Yes.
That's how profound the effect is on someone with diabetes who has a gastric sleeve operation, and how important these hormones are that are coming from the stomach. It's an interesting finding, and it just speaks to the complexity and the these forward feedback loops, and it's difficult. It's we're uncovering and learning new things every day about these hormones.
And these hormones have different effects depending on where the body they're exerting their effect. I mean, they do specific things in the brain, they do specific things in the gastrointestinal system, and sometimes they're completely different things, which doesn't necessarily match with like a layperson's understanding. If you say, hormone X makes you feel a certain way, but if you find it in this particular part of the body, it makes you feel a completely different way. That doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to a lot of people. And that's a snapshot of the complexity that the medical literature is battling with at all points in time. That's why
I almost see it like a I almost see it like a fractal, where so the fundamental concept of a fractal is it's sort of invariant to scale. So the more you zoom in, it looks the same with the same level of complexity. And I see that like the human body, you look at it from a macro sense, it's like, wow, that's a pretty complex system. And you zoom in onto like a really small part of it, and it's just as complex. And it's it's the weeds. The weeds just never stop. You just get lost in the weeds.
Yes, exactly. the weeds have weeds, and then those weeds have weeds.
Yeah.
So
But
what we want to achieve in this podcast is really dipping down into the weeds at various points, but we want to be portraying the general theme of what we're trying to say of the most current ideas when it comes to longevity and the biology of aging, and trying to achieve that mission of getting towards Methuselah.
absolutely.
So
So I
hopefully
think
we've outlined that fasting is a very good thing, regardless of when you do it, and recommended for all.
Yep.
Or time restricted feeding. And it looks like there could be better times to do it than others. And again, we're awaiting those replication studies. And we were specifically talking about pre-diabetic patients, which is, you know, a huge burden of disease that we find in our community. It's definitely a good starting point for this literature, because you can enact huge change here. And that leads on to saving health dollars, saving disability adjusted life years. It's definitely the entry point you want for this. But it's hard to normalize that for everyday people. But there does seem to be a general trend towards that early fasting group being better than the late fasting group.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for you and I.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Has this changed your mind? Do you think you'll adapt some of your fasting behaviors?
I think I'm going to try and do a more early fasting, early feeding window. But I can sort of do it now. There are some sacrifices that need to be made. The first sacrifice would be I wouldn't be able to have dinner with my girlfriend when she comes home.
Exactly. That's what was going to be my point as well. If I mean, it's the pandemic at the moment, but the social and cultural implications of this are not to be sneezed at. If your friends are saying let's catch up for dinner, and you say, well, I'm actually trying to do this this time restricted fasting, it's not a very popular party theme to get.
And
according
to touch on what you were saying, consistency is key. And so I can only imagine that it would be worse if you did, for some days, time restricted window in the morning and then switched to a time restricted afternoon window the next day.
Yes.
But you know what? I don't think that's a study that's been done.
Yeah,
I don't think people are switching this time restricted window and seeing what the effect is. It's an interesting question. Would it be bad? Would it be worse than actually not doing time restricted feeding at all?
Yeah. And it might be worse for some particular markers that you would test for, but better for others. It might have the inverse effect in testosterone, but worse in your lipid profile. Again, the complexity of this is cannot be overstated. But again, bringing it back to the simple, basic advice that we know that if you're hungry, it's going to be good for you. And if you can be hungry at parts of the day, that's better than being full or eating whenever you like.
Yeah.
The exercise.
It's good to bring it back to that central message.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. I think the space of prolonged fasting is an interesting one as well. You know, in as well as doing this time restricted feeding, if you pepper in long fasts every now and again, there's some evidence that's also has some added benefit for longevity. And there's lots of reasons why that might be. Potentially you're triggering autophagy on a much larger scale, and autophagy is a whole other kettle of fish that we can get into.
We definitely will get into that in the podcast, I think. Give it a basic summation would be cleaning house of the cell, so to speak. Would you agree?
I agree with that. So autophagy from the Greek auto and phage being to eat, auto one's self. So it's the cell sort of recycling its own components, eating itself, and reusing them.
Which is a very important factor that needs to be occurring on a daily basis. And this has implications towards cancer, towards a whole bunch of age-related issues.
Yep. And I guess the basic idea being that if you're fasted, your cells have more incentive to recycle its own components, and therefore you have a increased autophagy as a result, because you don't have this constant stream of new nutrients and new supply to the cell. So that would be, I guess, the central idea.
Yeah.
And the literature supports that idea.
Which and that's the gold mine, right? When you can find the mechanism and then study for that mechanism, then you're onto something when it comes to complete research.
To complicate it further, there are 3 different types of autophagy.
Yes.
And it seems like autophagy can be implicated in some things that aren't always good, like senescence. That autophagy might actually be necessary for senescence. So, the weeds thicken, my friend. The weeds thicken, even when it comes to autophagy. But broadly speaking, fasting can stimulate autophagy and be good.
Yes.
So,
Which, again, we'll try and link this up in future podcasts. But when the body is undergoing good types of stress, that seems to be, again, generalizing, a good thing for the body. And that you find the same sort of effects when you're talking about cardiovascular fitness, resistance training, even temperature stresses such as sitting in a sauna or cold baths. We'll try and link all those together in a future podcast. But it's naive to think that you should just always be in a nice sort of happy Zen-like centered state, which, more broadly speaking, is a very big cultural trend and shift these days. People are always sort of wanting to be in that perfect balance and say, I know I feel fantastic and I've got bucket loads of energy and you should do what I'm doing because I feel so perfect and centered. Sounds a bit pessimistic with the picture or painting, but I'm much more the guy of no. I like to be under stress at various points in the day. I want to be sweaty in the gym, feeling like I'm about to die for a lot of it, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. And if you can adopt that attitude when it comes to your diet and fasting as well, where you're saying I'm really hungry here, and there's food just over there. I should probably fix this. And you say, no, this is a challenge like any other. And small steps, obviously, and you build that up and then you can get comfortable sitting with that feeling and just think about all the good it's doing for you. Just like being in the gym, no one necessarily enjoys lifting heavy stuff or pushing themselves on a push bike or going for a run. Or in my case, doing martial arts where you're getting punched and kicked from every different direction. But this is what the body needs. You need to be exercising these traits.
I agree. I agree. Now I'm cognizant of the time. We've sort of hit the hour mark.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to wrap things up.
We can sort of think about what we might talk about next time. And I think we touched on this idea of prediabetes. And one of the hallmark treatments of diabetes is, of course, metformin.
Yes.
Has received some interesting press of late.
Yes,
the wonder drug in the biology of aging community as a wonder drug, or potentially maybe not quite the wonder drug, maybe.
With some exercise factors going on in there as well. I think that's a good next step.
So I think we should have a little chat about metformin next time.
Yeah, that sounds great. Give us a quick summation, you think, of some basic advice that we've touched on today.
So we've covered a lot of ground. Basic advice is start some time restricted feeding. It's a really simple step. Giving yourself a window of 8 hours to eat. It's a long time, and most people should be able to fit that in. But you'd be surprised, even if you think you're doing it now, how much you're not doing it right now.
Yes.
So download an app. The Zero app is a good one to help really zero in on that goal. And if you're so inclined as to go onto PubMed and look up literature, really attack that literature with a critical eye. Don't read abstracts. open up the paper, look at the methods they used, because abstracts are the jazz up version of the literature.
Yes, completely agree.
It's the keynotes, but the weeds are what define a paper.
Yes, yeah.
So,
and I would agree with everything you've just said. And to say to someone starting out, you'd be surprised about how you can sort of trick your body into making this quite an easy thing. And you and I have adopted that strategy of the main bulk of our fast happens while we sleep, which sort of gets you ahead of the game. And to take small steps and to do it in a way where you have to now decide that I'm not just going to do this for 30 days or 50 days or lose those 1 or 2 kilos. This has to be a complete lifestyle shift. It's like moving to a different part of the world. Like I'm no longer a Victorian, I'm heading to Fiji. So I have to adopt the lifestyle that's associated with Fiji, right? Otherwise you're going to be in a state of discontent most of the time. So if you decide to head on that fasting track, the way to do it successfully is to, okay, from now on, I'm going to be someone who is cognizant of when I eat, and that's going to be who I am moving forward. Take that into your identity, and then start off slow, look at maybe a 12-hour fast and slowly step up. We know that the bulk of benefits happen after 14 hours. And 16/8 seems to be the best sort of way to get that into your lifestyle. So couldn't advise that with as much gusto as I can't overstate how good it would be for your body. It's always a good direction to head in.
Yeah,
this has been fun.
It's been great. It's been awesome. I've had a lot of fun chatting about these topics, and I look forward to doing it again. And hopefully, if anybody's listening to this, they've gleaned something from the last hour. And if not, I'm sorry. And we'll promise to do better next time.
Yeah. There's always critiques to be had, especially when we're trying to deal with a technical audience and a layperson audience. We're going to make mistakes, but let us know what you think in the comments. Send through any other studies that you think would be interesting to us.
Absolutely.
And we want to be approachable and interactable.
Absolutely.
Thanks for your time, mate. This has been great. Let's do it again.
Until next time.
Thanks.